This section of the respiratory system chapter is going to look at gas exchange and transport, which is external respiration, transport of gases, and internal respiration, not necessarily in that order. These three functions have to go together in talking about them because they overlap quite a bit. I want to begin by pointing out where these things take place and what partial pressures are involved. Then I'm going to look at how oxygen is transported through the blood in hemoglobin. Then we'll look at external respiration and internal respiration side by side. This figure isn't in the book. I've created it actually to demonstrate something that the book covers but doesn't explicitly show in a form like this. The partial pressures of the two gases that we're most concerned with, oxygen and carbon dioxide, govern how those gases move in external respiration and internal respiration. Now, in this figure, I have highlighted 4 of the partial pressures, which are referred to directly in the book. The partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli, partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood of the lungs, and the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood near the tissues. The other terms here are derived from those, as partial pressures don't necessarily change so much from one location to the other. There is one which I'll mention in a little bit more detail, but the partial pressure of oxygen is higher in the alveoli than in the deoxygenated blood arriving at the lungs. It is 104 versus 40 millimeters of mercury delta P. And so oxygen is going to flow from the air into the blood, and generally speaking, a lot of sources will not put the partial pressure of oxygen in oxygenated blood exactly at equilibrium with the alveolar air. That may be because there's not quite enough time for the movement to reach equilibrium. I'm unsure exactly, but usually it's a little bit lower, 104 versus 100. When we get down to the tissues in oxygenated blood of systemic circulation, partial pressure of oxygen has fallen off a little bit. Here I have 95 millimeters of mercury, which many sources will suggest is accurate. Presumably what's happening is oxygen is coming out of the blood as it's passing through the cardiovascular circulation, simply to provide the endothelium and other cells of the arteries with an oxygen supply. Then when we get to the tissue, the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood at 95 millimeters mercury is much higher than the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissue at 40 millimeters mercury. So oxygen moves into the tissue. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the oxygenated blood is roughly 40 millimeters of mercury, and in the tissue I've put 47 millimeters of mercury, which represents the partial pressure that's suggested by the book. And so carbon dioxide moves out of the tissue and into the blood, bringing the blood partial pressure of carbon dioxide to 47 millimeters of mercury, which is what we see in deoxygenated blood. And then when that gets back to the alveoli, it moves down its pressure gradient from the deoxygenated blood into the alveoli. This figure is an oxygen saturation curve for hemoglobin, and we see the curve is at a rather flat level between the partial pressures of oxygen in the tissues at 40 millimeters of mercury and in the lungs at 100 millimeters of mercury. And those are the values that I showed in the earlier picture for those locations in circulation. Most people are going to have oxygen saturations in the near 100% range because we're averaging the oxygen saturation in the blood between arteries and veins. And so unless you're using oxygen in your skeletal muscle or something like that, you're going to probably have an average partial pressure of oxygen that's fairly high, and therefore the saturation is going to be in the upper 90s. It'll drop down a little bit as you exert yourself because you're using that oxygen to power muscle contraction or to power making ATP for muscle contraction. But it's not going to start to fall off into the more vertical part of the curve unless there's something seriously wrong with the partial pressure of oxygen. As long as partial pressures of oxygen are kept in that range, hemoglobin will carry oxygen in a fairly efficient manner. These two figures show how that hemoglobin oxygen saturation curve can change under certain conditions. In the top one, we see the effect of pH. Now, blood pH should normally be around 7.4, and so when the blood's slightly acidic at a pH of 7.2, the oxygen saturation curve is depressed. It's harder to carry oxygen in your blood. When the blood's a little basic, that increases the ability to carry oxygen. The 7.4 curve represents a nice stable balance between the two. The bottom image shows the effect of body temperature on oxygen saturation. As body temperature goes up, again, that depresses oxygen saturation in hemoglobin. As body temperature goes down, it improves it. However, there are many other detrimental effects to a low body temperature that wouldn't want to have occur. Consider how these two curves together relate to exercise. What's exercise going to do to blood pH, and what's exercise going to do to body temperature? And how important is it to saturate your hemoglobin with oxygen when you're exercising? Now let us consider external and internal respiration. External respiration is the exchange of gases between the alveoli air and the blood. Internal respiration is the exchange of gases between the blood and tissues. I have corrected this image from the one in the book slightly. There was an arrow in the wrong direction. The arrow at the bottom between hemoglobin, the arrow at the bottom in the reaction between oxygen and hemoglobin was pointing the wrong direction. So I flipped that arrow around to represent what's really happening here. The big arrows on the side are just showing the direction of gas movements between the air and the blood. Oxygen moves out of the air and into the blood down its partial pressure gradient of basically 104 versus 40 millimeters of mercury, and carbon dioxide moves out, again down its pressure gradient, which is 45 millimeters of mercury in the blood down to maybe 35 millimeters of mercury in the air. Oxygen will mostly go into the red blood cell. A small component of it, about 1.5% maybe, dissolves directly in the plasma, but the vast majority, which we'll concentrate on here, goes into the red blood cell. It combines with hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin at this point is protonated, which means that it has a hydrogen ion attached to it. So oxygen displaces the hydrogen ion, and we get oxyhemoglobin and a hydrogen ion to spare. That hydrogen ion then goes and combines with a bicarbonate ion, making carbonic acid. Carbonic anhydrase is an enzyme that will break that molecule down into carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide then leaves the red blood cell and goes into the air for exhalation. There is a little bit of carbon dioxide that's also present attached to hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin, and that dissociates and the carbon dioxide leaves the red blood cell, and that's more hemoglobin available for oxygen to bind to. The three arrows representing carbon dioxide show roughly about 7% carbon dioxide is just dissolved in the plasma and leaves. About 70% of the carbon dioxide is tied up in the carbonic acid reaction. And then the other 23, to make for an even 100%, is what's attached to hemoglobin directly. To represent internal respiration, I've modified this picture from the book. The one in the book doesn't have anything drawn in within the red blood cell representing the chemistry that's taking place. What I did is I took all of the chemistry represented in the red blood cell from the external respiration image and copied it over to put it here, and then flipped all of the arrows. Now, that's essentially what's happening in internal respiration. It's exactly like external respiration, except everything runs in the exact opposite direction. Now, in doing this, there is one little problem with this picture. There are 4 black arrows representing carbon dioxide moving into the blood. 2 are going directly into the plasma. They only really need 1 there. And then 2 are going into the red blood cell, which is appropriate because the carbon dioxide can either become part of the carbonic acid reaction or become carbaminohemoglobin. However, those black arrows don't quite point to the right place as I've placed the chemical reactions in here. The lower one points to the oxygen hemoglobin reaction, which is not really appropriate, but the level of control I have over modifying these images doesn't allow me to change that kind of arrow too easily. But flipping the straight arrows in these chemical reactions is pretty straightforward. So what we see here is that carbon dioxide goes into the red blood cell, and again, about 23% of it it is going to become carbaminohemoglobin, displacing oxygen, and we'll see where the oxygen comes from in a second. The other 70% that's getting into the red blood cell combines with a water molecule, carbonic anhydrase, catalyzes the combination to become carbonic acid, and then carbonic acid in solution dissociates into a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. The hydrogen ion, not the bicarbonate ion as this arrow suggests, the hydrogen ion then moves down to attach to hemoglobin. Now what's really happening here is the hydrogen ion is just making the pH inside the cell more acidic. And so the hemoglobin that's let go of the oxygen to go into the tissue will soak up those protons to buffer the pH inside of the red blood cell. That's really what's happening. The protonated hemoglobin, capital H, lowercase b, is really just a buffer within the cell. Speaking of buffers, what's not represented in either of these pictures is that the bicarbonate ion that is involved in the carbonic acid reactions is going to spend most of its time in the blood plasma, acting as a buffer there. When it's produced here in the tissues, it moves out in the plasma. When it's needed back in the alveolar capillaries, it moves from the plasma back into the red blood cells. We'll look at how the movement of bicarbonate across the membrane also requires the movement of chloride across the membrane in an opposite direction. That's not relevant here, but it's very important when we look at the carbonic acid reactions in the stomach lining and in the kidneys in the next 2 units we're going to look at. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. This question's a little bit differently framed than the way I usually ask questions here at the end of the presentations. I've set up an explanation which fits in with what's been covered so far in this presentation, and just asked a simple question with an either-or answer. The question is where carbon dioxide levels higher so that carbonic acid is formed, and that's in the tissues or in the blood going through the tissues during internal respiration. There's more carbon dioxide coming out of the tissues as a waste product, and it's carried through the blood because it gets incorporated into the carbonic acid reactions.